Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Before I start, I would like to thank my friend Sayyid Mahdi Naqvi for his help in researching this topic, as well as my friend Sajjad for narrating some quotations for me. I will also link the Salsabil Instagram and Twitter pages in the description of this video, so follow those. Today, I will be once again discussing the topic of Dhul Qarnayn and whether he can more feasibly be linked to Cyrus the Great, whom I covered in my previous video on the topic, or Alexander the Great, who is more often the name given. He was the king of Macedon, who annihilated and annexed much of the Achaemenid Persian Empire over the course of his 13-year-long reign. Again, I would like to preface this video by saying that this is just speculation, and we cannot know for certain who Dhul Qarnayn was historically. Allahu A'lam. I will begin by covering the secular historical account of Alexander, followed by the plethora of legends regarding him, and the similarities between these legends and the Dhul Qarnayn parable. I will then present some Islamic sources which attest to Alexander the Great being Dhul Qarnayn, and at the end I will highlight the biblical narrative of Cyrus in relation to both the Quranic story and the legends, and present my hypothesis in the conclusion. If you have not already, it might help if you watch my previous video on Cyrus, as I will be discussing evidence from that video here as well, especially in my conclusion, though that video will seem childish in comparison to this one. All sources are in the description as always. Dhul Qarnayn means the two-horned one in Arabic. He was a pious and just king who ruled over great swaths of land, as mentioned in Surah Al-Kahf. He is famous for his construction of the wall used to repel Ya'juj wa Ma'juj, whom I will refer to by their English names, Gog and Magog, throughout this video. I will focus on this subject more in this video, as I failed to cover it thoroughly in my previous one. As opposed to the Cyrus theory, which has only risen to prominence somewhat recently, the theory that Alexander the Great could have been Dhul Qarnayn is nearly as old as the Quran itself, and stems from similarities that can be found in legends and traditions that predate Islam. Do not be misled into thinking that the answer to this question is simple, even though it may seem so at parts of this video. First, we must establish exactly who Alexander the Great was according to secular history. Alexander III the Great was born in 356 BC to King Philip II of Macedon, whom he succeeded in 336 BC at the age of 20. Philip II was a great ruler, conqueror, and military strategist in his own right, but his exploits on the west side of the Aegean, which are unknown to most, would be nothing in comparison to his sons in the east. It's true, though, that without him the conquest of Alexander would not have been possible. During his youth, Alexander had the privilege of being tutored by the polymath Aristotle starting at the age of 13, truly conditioned to be a king. Many of the students who studied alongside Alexander would become his companions later in his life. His ascension to the throne was contested by some, who favored the installment of his infant half-brother Cyrus. However, this claimant faction would not last long, as Cyrus would die suspiciously before anything could get out of hand. After dealing with some domestic unrest in Greece, he visited the famous oracle at Delphi, who allegedly told Alexander, under an unknown context, that he was invincible, which Alexander took as a genuine prophecy. The latter half of this interaction is disputed, however, historical sources agree that he did, at least, visit the oracle in Delphi. Shortly after this, he would successfully put down rebellions on the northern and western frontiers of Macedonia, ending a rather chaotic first year in power. Yes, all of that in 1 year, yet still more was to happen before Alexander would cross the Dardanelles, or the Hellespont as it was known, into Asia Minor. Around this time, a rumor began to spread that Alexander had died whilst putting down the rebellion in the north. Hearing the false news, the city of Thebes, which had nearly revolted the previous year in the first months of Alexander's reign, went into a state of open rebellion, arresting Macedonian officials and raising its own army to fight against their perceivedly unrightful overlords. When Alexander arrived, to the Thebans' shock, they refused to surrender and hand their leaders over to him, so he besieged the city. After the Macedonians breached the wall of Thebes via a gate that had been somehow left open, some of its inhabitants resisted and were killed. Following the successful siege, he asked the representatives of the Hellenic League what he should do with Thebes, which was now occupied. He was advised to destroy it, and so he did, killing the men and selling all the women and children into slavery before burning everything to the ground, save for the temples to the gods. After settling all of these domestic issues, Alexander was finally ready to invade Asia Minor, with the purpose being the liberation of Ionian Greek cities across the Aegean. which had been under the presumably tyrannical rule of the Achaemenid Persians for centuries and had revolted once already 150 years earlier. I would like to note that Alexander was still in a precarious position, both politically and militarily. This invasion would have been extremely risky. A civil war was a possibility, and Alexander was low on money and supplies. Just before Alexander had crossed the Hellespont, his mother told him of, quote, the mystery of his birth, which is often interpreted to mean that his real father was one of the gods. He left after this, most likely a believer in his own divinity. Let's recognize the possibility that, by his crossing of the Hellespont, Alexander could have thought of himself as invincible and divine. These beliefs would explain some of his risky strategies in the coming war. Whilst at sea, Alexander sacrificed a bull to the god Poseidon, and after arriving in Asia, he made pilgrimage to Troy to visit the tomb of Achilles, where he paid tribute. With little money or supplies, the young king depended on his successful conquest of Achaemenid lands for both. Yet, as he would find out, the Greeks, whom he thought were oppressed by the Persians, did not seem to feel so themselves. They would not provide any support. Fortunately for Alexander, his success in the Battle of the Granicus River, which he probably should have lost, would relieve this stress, if only a little. Controversially, following this battle, Alexander would sell all 6,000 of the Greek mercenaries he captured into slavery, which was contrary to his initial casus belli, which was the liberation of Greeks, but it was all he could do for the time being. Alexander's successes, however, would only continue as he would go on to occupy most of Asia Minor, Tyre, then Egypt where he was crowned pharaoh, Assyria, Babylon, and Persis until the entirety of the Achaemenid Empire collapsed. Following his capture of Persepolis, Alexander would visit the grave of Cyrus the Great, only to find it desecrated and looted. He expressed his displeasure at this by putting the Magi on trial for failing in their responsibility to guard it. He would also order its restoration and place upon it a golden wreath as a sign of respect. This may have been nothing more than a publicity stunt, but I would like to think that Alexander genuinely held reverence for Cyrus. As a well-educated man, respect for tradition should have been second nature to him. The Achaemenid Persian Emperor Darius III went to take refuge in Ecbatana, where he was captured by the satrap of Bactria, Bessus, who would have him killed. This would decidedly mark the end of the Achaemenid Empire, and Alexander was left to pick up the pieces. From there, he would go on to conquer even further into Bactria and India. He would die in Babylon in 323 BC at the young age of 32, with the cause of death being unknown, but poisoning is likely. That was my abridged version of the story of Alexander the Great according to academic historical sources. It is evident that the Alexander being portrayed here cannot possibly have been Dhul Qarnayn. For instance, in these sources, Alexander is portrayed as a zealous pagan who visits soothsayers and might have believed in his own divinity. He could have had a hand in the death of his own infant brother. He did not act justly, as Dhul Qarnayn does in the Quran, nor do these sources attribute the construction of any wall to Alexander, or any of the other features of the Quranic narrative for that matter. However, in other later sources, such as the works of the Jewish Roman historian Flavius Josephus, Alexander is described as constructing iron gates near the Caspian Sea to defend against the nomadic Scythian peoples whom he described as synonymous with the Magogites from the books of Genesis and Ezekiel in the Tanakh. This was in reference to the Caspian Gates, sometimes called the Gates of Alexander because he had crossed them during his campaign in Persia. They were very real, and although not described in this manner as the location of a monument built by Alexander until Flavius Josephus, I thought I would give it mention as it correlates to the story of the wall built to seal away Gog and Magog, although that wall was typically thought to be in the Caucasus. There is no reference, not even in legend to my knowledge, of Cyrus building such a barrier, which is why I did not go in depth regarding this part of the Quranic story in my previous video. However, this topic will be paramount going forward as I discuss the Alexandrian legends. As one might expect, Alexander would quickly become integrated into literature, almost immediately after his death, causing many different legends to materialize and spread throughout the cultural traditions of the Mediterranean and Near East. For example, Alexander is mentioned in the Talmud as, quote, ascending to great heights so he could view the world as a sphere, end quote, which is similar to some other non-Jewish legends which recount him ascending to the heavens. And it was through these legends that people would come to know Alexander, especially during the Middle Ages, as the Anabasis of Alexander by Flavius Arrianus, widely considered to be the primary historical source on Alexander, was only revived during the Renaissance. The Alexander Romance was most likely the first of these legends, written originally in ancient Greek, then expanded upon and translated many times throughout history. In fact, it was so widespread and dynamic during the Middle Ages and even before that the Encyclopedia Britannica considers Alexander romance to be a genre in and of itself. Whilst the Alexander romance is a very important part of literary history and tradition, it is not the main Alexandrian legend we will be examining today, that being the Nesana, or the Syriac Alexander Legend, which is a compilation of many already existing traditions combined into one narrative. This is important because the Quranic story displays a similar combination of traditions, and both stories are similar to one another. It can be assumed that the Nesana took much influence from the countless different Alexander romance traditions floating around due to their prevalence throughout this period, although it remains its own distinctive story with heavy Christian themes. A disclaimer before continuing: Alexandrian legends such as the Alexander romance or the Nesana have been subject to rigorous academic analysis for a very long time. The latter, which I will be covering in more depth, has been studied in detail since the early 20th century, starting with Andrew Rooney Anderson. Someone who is recurring in my sources, the academic Dr. Tommaso Tesei, has been studying the Nesana and its relation to the story of Dhul Qarnayn for over 12 years and has extensive written works on the topic, so there is no way that I can do this niche field of study justice in merely a couple hundred hours of research. For instance, I'm not aware of how these legends evolved over time from the original Alexander romance and the countless traditions that stemmed from it. I will be as comprehensive as possible whilst trying to keep this video brief. Also, there is a false claim against the Quran that it is in fact copying or retelling this story, the Nesana, which is decidedly incorrect, although the similarities between the two are undeniable, as we shall see. The manuscript used for the Nesana is generously dated from 629 to 636 AD, following the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ to Medina, whereas we know that Surah Al-Kahf was revealed around a decade before this in Mecca. It is valid to argue that the Nesana manuscript draws inspiration from earlier traditions. Indeed, some scholars studying the Nesana hypothesize that an earlier, nearly identical text exists. However, even if the latter were the case, the Quran still could not have been directly copying or retelling from either old versions of the Nesana or the other earlier traditions, mainly because there are significant differences between them that I will highlight later in the video. Not only this, but these verses were revealed as an answer to a question posed to the Prophet ﷺ, most likely from visiting Yathribite Jewish rabbis. If this specific tale were well known at the time, then those asking the question would have most likely found issue with the Prophet's answer, recognizing that he was simply retelling a common myth. Still, it would be a non-issue, as the context in which the story is mentioned in the Quran is appealing to the reality of the person questioning the Prophet ﷺ, rather than the universal objective reality, meaning that the answer could have been as simple as whoever that person asking the question understood the two-horned one to be. Either way, the Nesana could not have been a direct quote-unquote source for the Quran, nor is it likely that the Quran was a source for the Nesana, which will be an important point later in this video. I will link a lengthy essay proving that the Nesana is not a source for the Quran in the description for anyone interested. However, if you wish to read it, I recommend reading it after completing this video. Before I go over the contents of the Nesana, I will read the story of Dhul Qarnayn from the Quran in full, but know that this still does not complete the picture. I really wish to demonstrate the similarities and differences between these sources, and I urge you to keep them in mind, as they will be vital later on as I introduce a third primary source. Here are verses 83 to 99 of chapter 18 in the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf, as translated by Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall. They will ask thee, O Muhammad, of Dhul Qarnayn. Say, I shall recite unto you a remembrance of him. Lo, we made him strong in the land, and gave him unto everything a road. And he followed a road, till, when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it setting in a muddy spring, and found a people thereabout. We said, O Dhul Qarnayn, either punish or show them kindness. He said, As for him who doeth wrong, we shall punish him, and then he will be brought back unto his Lord, who will punish him with an awful punishment. But as for him who believeth and doeth right, good will be his reward, and we shall speak unto him a mild command. Then he followed a road, till when he reached the rising place of the sun, he found it rising on a people for whom we had appointed no shelter therefrom. So it was, and we knew all concerning him. Then he followed a road, till when he came between the two mountains, he found upon their hither side a folk that scarce could understand a saying. They said, O Dhul Qarnayn, lo! Gog and Magog are spoiling the land, so may we pay thee tribute on condition that thou set a barrier between us and them? He said, That wherein my Lord hath established me is better than your tribute. Do but help me with strength of men. I will set between you and them a bank. Give me pieces of iron, till when he had leveled up the gap between the cliffs, he said, Blow! Till when he had made it a fire, he said, Bring me molten copper to pour thereon. And Gog and Magog were not able to surmount, nor could they pierce it. He said, This is a mercy from my Lord, but when the promise of my Lord cometh to pass, he will lay it low, for the promise of my Lord is true. And on that day we shall let some of them surge against the others, and the trumpet will be blown. Then we shall gather them together in one gathering. Additional to this are two verses in Surah Al-Anbiya that describe the coming of Gog and Magog, verses 96 to 97. Until, when Gog and Magog are let loose, and they hasten out of every mound, and the true promise draweth nigh, then behold them, staring wide in terror, the eyes of those who disbelieve. They will say, Alas for us! We lived in forgetfulness of this. Ah, but we were wrongdoers. In the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, Gog and Magog are described as inordinately vast in number and unconquerable in strength. They will envelop the entire world and then set their sights upon the heavens. This is alike to their descriptions in the Old Testament in Ezekiel chapter 38, the New Testament in Revelation chapter 20, and most prominently the Nesana. These hordes are used as vehicles of God's wrath in all of these texts. I will now compare the Quranic narrative to that of the Nesana, which I find to be a profoundly beautiful and potent story in its own right. Within the Nesana, Alexander is portrayed as being a zealous Christian, contrary to secular history, of course. Here are some quotations from the beginning of the text illustrating this. And Alexander bowed himself and did reverence, saying,
O God, Lord of kings and judges, thou who sets up kings and destroyest their power, I know in my mind that thou hast exalted me above all kings, and thou hast made me horns upon my head, wherewith I might thrust down the kingdoms of the world. I will magnify thy name, O Lord, forever, and if the Messiah, who is the Son of God, comes in my days, I and my troops shall worship him.
Also note the description of Alexander here featuring horns. As I discussed in my video on Cyrus, the term two-horned one could apply to the two-horned ram in Daniel chapter 8 verse 20 that symbolizes the kings of Media and Persia, one of whom being Cyrus, but it could also feasibly represent Alexander, who is depicted donning the horns of the Egyptian god Amun-Ra as early as 242 BC on coins and the like. So we know that the portrayal of Alexander with two horns was conventional and can be applied to him just as easily as it could be applied to Cyrus, as we see in the aforesaid quote.
Give me power from the holy heavens, that I may receive strength greater than that of the kingdoms of the world, and I may humble them. And I will magnify thy name, O Lord, forever, and thy memorial shall be from everlasting to everlasting. And I will write the name of God in the charter of my kingdom, that there may be for thee a memorial always.
The idea of Alexander being established by God is evident in these passages, and this mirrors the Quran in its saying, We made him strong in the land, and gave him unto everything a road. Following these supplications and proclamations by Alexander, he begins his journey, for he explains to his counselors his curiosity regarding the ends of the earth and the heavens which he wishes to traverse. The first place where we can observe prominent similarities between the narratives can be seen when Alexander and his army travel to where the sun rises over the sea in the east. His rays are so harsh that people flee from him and hide in the sea, and when he passes through the heavens, it melts the mountains therein, killing man and beast alike. This segment is similar to verse 90 of Surah Al-Kahf, which says, He found the sun rising on a people for whom we had appointed no shelter therefrom. The difference being that in the Alexander legend the sun's rays are extremely harsh, yet the people are still able to hide from them, whereas in the Quran, God says that he gave them no shelter from the sun at all. The second and most crucial piece connecting these two stories is Alexander's visit to the Caucasus, where he would build his wall to seal away Gog and Magog. Magog is one of the sons of Japheth, son of Noah, mentioned in Genesis chapter 10. In Ezekiel chapter 38, Gog is a chieftain who commands a massive horde, and Magog is his land. This is what Josephus would have been referring to when he called the Scythians Magogites. In the legend, Alexander is told of a monstrous folk who live beyond the Caucasus Mountains, identified as the Huns, a Turkic people who invaded Eastern Europe and Germania and raided northern Italy during the late 4th century and early 5th century AD, laying waste to all that they touched and causing chaos within Rome. These people are described in a horrifying manner, similar to how the peoples of Gog and Magog are described in Islamic sources. For example,
They are swifter than the wind that blows, they outstrip the whole world. For they are sorcerers, and they run between heaven and earth, and their chariots and swords and spears flash like fearful lightnings. They carry maces in their hands, and the noise of each one's outcry is more terrible than the voice of a lion. For it is the will of God that delivers the nations into each other's hand, and their terror is fearful upon all creatures that seize them, for they are no lovers of mankind.
in a later poem falsely attributed to the Syriac poet Mar Jacob, it says, quote, "They bathe in blood, and in blood wash they also their heads. They drink blood, and eat the flesh of men. They wear skins, sharpen their weapons, and forge wrath, and are more ferocious, and wage war more so than all other nations." End quote. The same poem refers to the Huns as the families of Gog and Magog, exclusively without mentioning any other tribes. Some descriptions of Gog and Magog we find in later Islamic sources can be found here as well, such as their extremely tall stature and flat noses. Every single source attests to their vast numbers. In Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 14 to 16, it says, quote, "Then you, Gog, will come from your place out of the far north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great company and a mighty army." End quote. The book of Revelation, chapter 20, verse 8, says that their, quote, "number is as the sand of the sea." And the Quran says that they will, quote, "hasten out of every mound." The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ states that they will be so large in number that they will stop to drink from a river and drink it dry. And here is a quotation from the Nesana giving its explanation for why their army might be so large.
"When they go forth to war, they fetch a pregnant woman, and pile up a fire, and buy her in front of the fire, and cook her child within her. And her belly bursts open, and the child cometh forth roasted. Then they lay it in a trough, and throw water upon his body, and his body melts away in this water. And they take their swords and bows and arrows and spears, and dip them in this water. And to everyone whom this water touches, it appears that there were 100,000 horsemen with him. And by the side of every 100 men there seems to stand 100,000 bands of demons, for their sorceries are greater than those of all kingdoms."
I will not make any conclusions regarding the nature of Gog and Magog. In fact, that could be a video on its own. Rather, I am mentioning this because it illustrates undeniable similarities between the texts. Alexander was grieved upon hearing about these ferocious people and decided that they should construct a wall to prevent them from spoiling the lands any longer. So he gathered thousands of workers in iron and brass, as opposed to iron and copper in the Quran, and began work between two great mountains. Once the wall of iron and brass was complete, he had a prophecy engraved upon it that claimed that in 940 years, the tribe sealed therein would call upon the Lord, asking for him to bring it down, and so he would, and they would be unleashed upon the world and ravage it. The aforementioned hadith about Gog and Magog says something similar, that every time they attempt to breach the wall by digging, God replaces the dirt by morning. But one day they will say, "We will breach it tomorrow, if God wills." And that will be the day that they are released upon the world. After prophesying the return of Gog and Magog, Alexander cites the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, verses 14 to 15, which read, "Then the Lord said to me, Out of the north calamity shall break forth on all the inhabitants of the land. For behold, I am calling all the families of the kingdoms of the north, says the Lord. They shall come, and each one set his throne at the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem, against all its walls all around, and against the cities of Judah." Then Alexander says, quote, "For when the Lord seeks to slay men, he sends men against men, and they destroy one another," end quote, before departing with his men. This mirrors the mention of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel I mentioned earlier. The parallels here are obvious, so I want to focus on highlighting the differences. The Quranic story specifies that Dhul Qarnayn goes to the setting place of the sun and to the rising place of the sun, whereas the Nesana only tells of Alexander's journey to the rising place of the sun in the east. Not only this, but the Quran does not include many of the extra details provided in the Nesana about this rising place of the sun. I will read the parable from the story directly to demonstrate this. Alexander and his troops went up between the Fetid Sea and the Bright Sea to the place where the sun enters the window of heaven. For the sun is a servant of the Lord, and neither by night nor by day does he cease from his traveling. The place of his rising is over the sea, and the people who dwell there, when he is about to rise, flee away and hide themselves in the sea, that they be not burnt by his rays. And he passes through the midst of the heavens to the place where he enters the window of heaven, and wherever he passes there are terrible mountains, and those who dwell there have caves hollowed out in the rocks, and as soon as they see the sun passing over them, men and birds flee away from before him and hide in the caves, for rocks are rent by his blazing heat and fall down, and whether they be men or beasts, as soon as the stones touch them, they are consumed. And when the sun enters the window of heaven, he straightway bows and makes obeisance before God his Creator, and he travels and descends the whole night through the heavens, until at length he finds himself where he rises. The added details make this passage seem much more allegorical than the verse in the Quran, illustrating a flat earth with a geocentric model if taken literally. These details are not included in the Quranic version, and when Dhul Qarnayn travels to the place of the sun's rising, it could simply be interpreted to mean that he went very far east. Lastly, and this may seem small, but the Quran claims the wall to be made out of iron and copper rather than iron and brass. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. This will be important later. Aside from this, the two stories exhibit many similarities, even in the most minute details, such as the wall being built between two mountains, something that is often overlooked. Similarly, the Talmud mentions the legendary Alexander in Bava Metzia, chapter 2, page 5, line 7, quote, Alexander the Macedonian went to the king of Cassia. He saw that he had with him much gold, much silver. He told him, I do not need your gold nor your silver. I came only to see your practice, how you are dealing, how you are judging. Although it is not as remarkable or evident, Alexander refusing the gold and silver of the king of Cassia is alike to Dhul Qarnayn refusing the tribute offered to him in Surah Al-Kahf, verses 94 and 95. That wherein my Lord hath established me is better than your tribute. With all of these similarities in the narratives, the Quran must be referring to the mythical Alexander, right? Well, many early Muslims thought so, with this idea being illustrated quite well by this parable from the works of the well-known historian Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari in his Tarikh. Quote, after Darius's demise, Alexander the Great finalized the incorporation of his realm, assuming control over Iraq, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. It is documented that on the day that he assumed his throne as the king of Persia, he proclaimed thusly, through the grace of Allah, we have achieved victory over Darius and achieved the opposite of what he threatened us with. Alexander then razed cities, strongholds, and the Zoroastrian temples of the Persians. He slew their priests, and he set fire to their texts and Darius's library. End quote. Similar to the Christian Alexander legend, At-Tabari describes Alexander as a monotheist, although here he quote-unquote righteously destroys Persian cities and temples and righteously slays their priests, all whilst glorifying Allah in doing so. A ridiculous notion, as Muhammad ﷺ forbade all of these things when outlining his rules for warfare. Still, a monotheist nonetheless, which is all that is important here as it lines up with Dhul Qarnayn. The idea originates from early translations of the Alexander legends, which include the story of Alexander building a wall to seal away Gog and Magog. According to Richard Stoneman, the earliest of these stories written in Arabic was between 767 and 815 AD. Because of the significant influence of Aristotle on Islamic philosophy, this story was latched onto since he was one of Alexander's tutors, and thus by extension one of Dhul Qarnayn's if we were to accept that they were one and the same. The translation of the Nesana into Arabic was titled Qisas Dhul Qarnayn, or The Stories of Dhul Qarnayn, so the direct connection is apparent. The philosopher Ibn Sina, Latinized Avicenna, also believed that Dhul Qarnayn was Alexander, and the polymath Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi affirmed it, agreeing with the opinion of Ahmed bin Ajiba in his Tafsir al-Bahr al-Madid. Some incongruous reports put forth other figures, such as the Himyarite king Tubba, but these can all be discounted, and the two central figures I intend to cover in this video are Alexander and Cyrus. It is understandable that the Muslims come to this conclusion, and it's clear why the idea has persisted even today, with such prominent thinkers, scholars, and theologians affirming it. Some would assume that the reason for this parable's revelation was one of warning, to warn the believers of a coming apocalypse and the final day of reckoning, and that this story was primarily allegorical. That is the opinion of some, although I still believe that it is possible that the Quran is referring to an actual historical figure and not an entirely mythical one. I will introduce a third source to predicate this. Cyrus the Great is another figure who has often been pointed to in the Dhul Qarnayn debate for his purported monotheism, just nature, vast conquests, and most prominently because he is God's anointed in the Bible. I briefly covered the story of Cyrus according to Xenophon and Herodotus, and also the Bible in my previous video. In that video, I show how the Quran demonstrates an understanding of the biblical Cyrus in its description of Dhul Qarnayn. Recall that it is most likely, according to different ahadith, that the group of people asking the Prophet ﷺ about the two-horned one were Yathribite Jews, with rabbis amongst them. And there were others present, but for now we will focus on the rabbis. With this in mind, let us recall the prophetic visions of Daniel alayhi salam in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, of a two-horned ram and a one-horned goat. Daniel, chapter 8, verses 3-7. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram which had two horns. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will, and became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had two horns, and ran at him with furious power, and broke his two horns. There was no power the ram had to withstand him." End quote. This is undeniably in reference to the rise of the Achaemenids under Cyrus, and then the subsequent rise of Macedon under Alexander, the former coming from the east and the latter coming from the west. Biblical scholars attest to this. Now, with the knowledge that Cyrus was a king of Persia and Media, the two-horned ram, we shall look back a few centuries to the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, where God talks to King Cyrus, the Messiah, who would free the Jews from the Babylonian exile and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Regardless of whether it was a true prophecy of Cyrus written by Isaiah or not, it is still the oldest source sharing likenesses with the Dhul Qarnayn parable, and by extension the Nesana. Note that although Isaiah 45 mentions Cyrus, it does not mention that he is a king of Media or Persia, making the two prophecies' connections not immediately apparent. I determined in my previous video that the Quran demonstrates an understanding of Daniel 8 and Isaiah 45 and how it describes Dhul Qarnayn to the Jews, but we now know that it is aware of the Nesana as well. It is also crucial to acknowledge that the Nesana was not its own completely original story, that it took from previously existing material, and also that the Quran was most probably not amongst the material it took from. Keep all of this in mind as I reference the following verses. Isaiah chapter 45 verse 1. "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors, so that the gate will not be shut." End quote. Here the Lord proclaims that Cyrus is chosen by him, and that by God's will he would subdue nations without difficulty. Alexander and Dhul Qarnayn are described in the same way. Alexander is established by God, as can be seen by his saying in the Nesana, "You have exalted me above all kings." And concerning Dhul Qarnayn, Allah says in the Quran, "We made him strong in the land, and gave him unto everything a road." Verse 2. "I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron." End quote. In some translations, the line, "and make the crooked places straight," is replaced with, quote, "and I will level the mountains," based on differences between the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, all early manuscripts of the Tanakh, in which this verse can be found. The Hebrew word being translated as bronze here is an interpretation based on context. Biblical Hebrew did not differentiate between copper and copper alloys, meaning the original word in Hebrew here is copper. As we can see again here, there are similarities between all three texts. In the Bible, God will destroy a gate of copper and cut bars of iron. In the Nesana, God will level the wall of brass, another alloy of copper, and iron, come the end times, unleashing Gog and Magog upon the world. In the Quran, the wall is copper and iron, using the same materials as the Bible, and Allah will bring it down, like the Nesana, to unleash Gog and Magog upon the world before the Day of Judgment. In the Bible, God will level mountains, and in the Nesana and the Quran, the gate is built between two mountains, so mountains are a recurring theme. This point is small, but I want to be as comprehensive as possible here. verses 5 to 6. I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God besides me. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun to its setting that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other." End quote. God is saying that he has girded or strengthened Cyrus so that everyone from the rising place of the sun to the place of its setting would believe in the God of Israel. In the Quran, Dhul Qarnayn travels from the place of the sun setting to the place of its rising, acting in justice, and by doing so, doing exactly what this Bible verse is attributing to Cyrus. The Nesana narrates that Alexander only travels to the place of the sun's rising and not to the place of the sun's setting. Verse 7. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. End quote. Something small, yet fair to point out nonetheless. God exemplifies his omnipotence by saying that he makes peace and calamity. In the Nesana and the Quran, which we have already established share similarities with this chapter in Isaiah, God promises an apocalypse, before which he will release Gog and Magog upon the world, and they will destroy it. Note also that God uses Gog and Magog to create calamity in the books of Ezekiel, chapters 38 to 39, and Jeremiah 14, which I referenced previously. And lastly, verse 13. I have raised him up in righteousness, and I will direct all his ways. He shall build my city, and let my exiles go free, not for price nor reward, says the Lord of hosts. Here God again mentions how he will guide Cyrus, as he does in verse 1 of this chapter. The quotes, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held to subdue nations before him, and to open before him the double doors," illustrate this. The Nesana does not mention anything like this specifically, simply keeping to the idea that Alexander was established by God. The Quran, however, says something very similar to the Bible in verse 84 of Al-Kahf, with Allah saying, "We made him strong in the land and gave him unto everything a road." And in the latter half of this Bible verse, God proclaims that Cyrus will free the Jews from their exile and rebuild the temple, not for price or reward. Again, a small detail, but Dhul Qarnayn graciously refuses tribute from those asking him to build the wall, and Alexander in the Nesana also builds the wall without payment. Even in the Talmud, during Alexander's visit to the end of the earth, he rejects the gold and silver from the king of Cassia, so minor similarities in these related characters can be observed over 4 different sources. Knowing now that the Quran includes aspects from both the story of Cyrus in the Bible and the mythical legends of Alexander, it is pretty easy to see how the Dhul Qarnayn parable would answer the posed question for anyone present. If it were Jews who were asking who the two-horned one was, the Quran demonstrated its knowledge of Cyrus as the two-horned one, exemplified by Isaiah 45, and especially Daniel 8. If anyone else were present who were perhaps familiar with the legends of Alexander, the answer given in Surah Al-Kahf would also suffice for them, as Alexander could also feasibly be referred to as two-horned, as I mentioned earlier, and a specific name was not given in the Quran for who Dhul Qarnayn was. But the point of this video is to get to the bottom of who it was truly in reference to, and claiming that it was in reference to both fails at this. As we delve into the next segment of this video, remember that the Nesana was an amalgamation of different older legends with plausibly existent earlier versions, as that is the context in which I will refer to it from here on in, and not simply as a single manuscript of one individual story. Let us reflect on the differences between the Nesana and the Quran, 2 differences in particular, and then compare these differences with the contents of Isaiah. In the Quran, the wall is made of copper and iron, whereas in the Nesana, it is brass and iron. The Bible also refers to copper and iron. The Quran agrees with the Bible in its use of words, indicating that it favors the narrative details from the story of Cyrus in this instance, rather than that of the legendary Alexander. Biblical scholars have suggested that the reference to copper gates and bars of iron refers to the 100 gates of bronze in Babylon, as documented by Herodotus. However, it's important to acknowledge that this interpretation remains speculative. Regardless, the striking linguistic parallels between the passages cannot be ignored, even in the absence of a directly shared narrative. This one similarity alone would not be enough to prove anything, but thankfully there is another instance of this in verse 6 of Isaiah 45. According to the Bible, Cyrus's conquests would cause people to acknowledge the supremacy of the God of Israel, from the rising place of the sun to the place of its setting. The Nesana recounts a story where Alexander travels to the rising place of the sun, but not the place of its setting, and even when he arrives, he does not call anyone to the one true God. The Quran, on the other hand, again agrees with the Bible over the Nesana in its wording, saying that Dhul Qarnayn travels to both the rising place of the sun and the place of its setting, and his rewarding of those who believe is comparable to the narrative of Cyrus in the Bible. It is evident that the author of the Quran knew of or had access to both the Bible and the legends related to Alexander, as he was able to produce a concise parable with a strong message that incorporated elements from both of these sources. And with each disparity between the two, it consistently aligned itself with the story of Cyrus in the Bible, rather than the story of Alexander from legend. In fact, Dr. Tommaso Tesei, who I mentioned previously as a renowned scholar on the topic, mentions that, quote, the Nesana somehow incorporates traits that other traditions, i.e. the Bible, attributed to Cyrus, end quote. So if the Nesana takes from aspects of Cyrus in the Bible, why does the Quran include even more of these aspects and agree with the Bible on every point of contention? As I mentioned previously, the story of the Nesana was rooted in legends that had likely been circulating for a significant amount of time before its authorship and were allegedly widespread, so it most probably did not copy the story from the Quran, directly or indirectly. Not only this, but modern scholars tend to indicate that the Quran and the Nesana shared sources, i.e., they were both representing the same legend or group of legends, so why wouldn't the Quran simply agree with those legends and choose instead to go with the Bible? This pattern strongly suggests that Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran is in reference to Cyrus. Consequently, it becomes plausible to argue that the Alexander legends might have also been alluding to Cyrus. How might this have happened? Well, it is merely speculation on my part, but one could assume that these legends were not initially attributed to Alexander. We know that they have nothing to do with the historical Alexander, as he was a Hellenic pagan. In fact, these legends are so far removed from Alexander that they could be completely independent characters on their own. Cyrus, on the other hand, was a Zoroastrian who were, at the time, monotheists and cannot be compared at all to the Zoroastrians of the time of the Prophet ﷺ, who were primarily polytheistic Zervanites, essentially a completely different religion. Furthermore, it is well established that the historical Cyrus was characterized by his sense of justice and is attributed with formulating what modern scholars regard as the first charter of human rights, an oversimplified anachronism, but it conveys just how equitable he was as a ruler. He did not conquer, rather he liberated. He is famous for his construction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Everyone who came under his rule sang his praises. In Isaiah, and in fact the rest of the Bible, such as Ezra, Cyrus is a righteous king, Messiah to the Jews, and chosen by God. The Bible also recounts how he rebuilt the Temple of Solomon. Although the legends cannot be directly attached to the historical Cyrus, the characters of Alexander in the Nesana and Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran can be, through simple inference, at least attached to the biblical Cyrus. The massive number of similarities between the sources in the words used, the themes, pieces of the narrative such as Gog and Magog, and the archetypal divinely anointed king all indicate this. Some may argue that the Cyrus cylinder proves Cyrus's polytheism, which is simply not true. It outlines policies of religious tolerance and methods for governance utilized during Cyrus's reign. Cyrus did not write it, nor is there any proof that he had a hand at all in its creation. It is written about Cyrus in praise of him in Akkadian and Old Persian, found in Babylon. The insinuation being made here is that just because Cyrus did not indiscriminately destroy the idols of other religions, he could not have been a monotheist. However, this is not the case, for being intolerant would have benefited not him nor the religion of God in any way in this context. Some might claim that Zoroaster was not a prophet mentioned in Abrahamic scripture, and thus his religion could not probably be accepted by God. This is sophistry, as the Quran says in Surah Fatir, quote, "There is not a nation but a warner hath passed among them," end quote, and ahadith mention that there were greater than 124,000 prophets throughout history before Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning that the ones mentioned in Islamic scripture probably make up less than 0.03% of the total number. The Gathas of Zoroaster indicate monotheism, and this is all we can really go off of, not the Avesta widely, as almost none of the Avesta is accredited to Zoroaster, save the Gathas. Another possible argument could be that the Quran was sourcing from a different legend which itself incorporated more aspects of Cyrus's story from the Bible. This is conjecture. No modern scholar would affirm this idea without physical proof. Some Muslims might argue that Cyrus could not be Dhul Qarnayn, since this theory only came about in the last 2 centuries, and was initially proposed by an orientalist by the name of Gustav Moritz Redslob, rather than any classical Islamic scholars. Whilst I greatly respect classical Islamic scholarship, of course, I feel that their opinion on this matter is not particularly significant as it doesn't pertain to theology. The only sources that they would have had access to were the Bible and the Alexander Legends, which sometimes even had Alexander's name swapped with Dhul Qarnayn. Most scholars simply did not care about who Dhul Qarnayn was, as it wasn't important theologically, and those who did often claimed it was Alexander based on the legends. Many Muslims were familiar with the Tanakh, but to connect the 2-horned ram and Cyrus would have been more work than it is now, and of course, due to the internet, we have a plethora of sources that classical Islamic scholars unfortunately did not. As for the fact that it was proposed first by an Orientalist, I don't think that that is of any importance, rather it is the substance of the claim which matters, and I believe I have provided a lot of that here. I'm not saying that this is the objective truth regarding the matter, or that this position is immune to criticism. Rather, my intention is to introduce a new idea into the Dhul Qarnayn debate, which has been going on for over 1300 years now, revolutionized by modern scholarship and then by the internet. And by no means am I partaking in apologetics here, as they are not necessary whatsoever in regard to this specific parable. This comparison and hypothesis was created just for fun, as I was not able to find anyone connecting these 3 sources in such a manner elsewhere, and I realize, although it might have some substance to it, that it is based mostly upon conjecture from translated texts, and goes against the current scholarly consensus. In the end, as I stated in the beginning of this video, we cannot be certain of who Dhul Qarnayn was. Even with my explanation, there are still many missing pieces, since there is no proof of these Alexander legends being attributed to anyone else, and certainly not Cyrus, not yet at least. In any case, the main reason for the revelation of these verses was not to act as history, but rather to warn the people of the coming apocalypse and remind them of the day of judgment, which it does so in an eloquent and beautiful manner, even if you interpret the story allegorically. I hope you enjoyed this semi-in-depth analysis on who Dhul Qarnayn could have been historically, and why I believe if the Quran was indeed referring to a historical figure, that it must have been Cyrus the Great. I will end this video with another passage from the Bible, also in Isaiah, concerning Cyrus. Who raised one up from the east? Who in righteousness called him to his feet? Who gave the nations before him and made him rule over kings? Who gave them as the dust to his sword, as driven stubble to his bow? Who pursued them and passed safely by the way that he had not gone with his feet? Who has performed and done it, calling the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, am the first, and with the last I am he. Liking the video and subscribing to the channel always helps, of course. Until next time, take care. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم.